This is Josh Summers, host of the All Things Secured YouTube channel, and you are listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I am your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 420 for March 15th, 2025. Insert your marijuana joke here. So a couple things before we set up this interview. First of all, we just had the 8th anniversary for this podcast. I started this on March 8th, 2017. Man, it's hard to believe it's been going that long. But I just realized it, so I thought I would mention it here. I will be working on a new patron promotion, probably for the month of April. So stay tuned for more information about that if you've been drooling over one of my Dragon Challenge coins. And by the way, these are pretty kick-butt challenge coins. I mean, I've seen plenty of them in my day, and I get a lot of compliments on these things. If you want to get a sneak peek at that, you can go to fdsd.me/coin2, as in the number 2. But I think I'm going to do a patron promotion in April that will give away some more of those coins. Sadly, I can pretty much only do that in the United States because they're really expensive to ship around the world. But I'll have some other reasons for patrons to join as well that will not be region restricted. One more thing real quick before we set up the interview. Update like all your things. There's been a lot of important security updates recently, both for smartphones and desktop computers of all varieties. In fact, even routers, if you have a TP-Link router, particularly an AX21, you need to get the firmware updated on that ASAP. I'll talk more about that next week, but basically just get all the updates. Check for updates on all your devices, and if they're there, get those installed soon. All right, so I've got a really great interview for you today. I've been wanting to talk to Josh for a long time. I've followed him for several years on his All Things Secured website, and especially his YouTube site. He's got some really great videos, like lots and lots of really great videos. He's very good at explaining things. His target audience is the same as my target audience, which is regular, everyday people. And I really like his approach to these topics. We're going to get into a bunch of that stuff today, but he's got a really interesting story for why he got into all of this in the first place. A very interesting perspective. I do have some other interesting notes at the end of the show, so stay tuned for that. But for now, let's get right to our interview with Josh Summers. Josh Summers is an entrepreneur who became a privacy advocate while living and traveling in China. After seeing what's possible with video surveillance, internet censorship, and device tracking, he's made it a point to educate both himself and the average internet user about basic privacy on his website, All Things Secured, and on his YouTube channel. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Thank you for having me.
I've really been looking forward to this. I've been following your stuff for a long time. You do really great work. I think we're kind of in the same wheelhouse, even though we have different formats. I've always been trying to reach the average everyday person, which is like 99% of the planet, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And trying to interpret stuff for them that I think that, I try to look at myself as somebody who can, that explains technical stuff to a non-technical audience.
Yes.
So I think we're similar in that regard. So, but tell me, before we get into it, how did you come to start All Things Secured, and like, what do you see as your mission there?
Yeah, I mean, it actually started in a very selfish way, honestly, because like you said, I was in China. And if you know anything about China, I was there through basically the 2008 Olympics is when, we're in the middle of the beginning of our time there, me and my wife. And that was when censorship really started taking over. Like the government had always kind of censored things, but it was always in the background. Then in 2008 and 2009, that's when Facebook and Google and all of these things started like really getting the hammer in terms of internet censorship. And so I naturally had to, like every other, foreigner that was living in China at the time, had to start using a VPN. And that was really my introduction into this world of privacy and security, was through just wanting to access my email, watch YouTube, those really basic, not like some altruistic, I need privacy and security. It was, no, I need to watch YouTube. I need to check my email. And so that was really what got me into it all.
For those of us who've never been and certainly never lived there, what is it like living in China? What is it like dealing with that level of censorship? Is it everything, all the bad things we've heard of? Is it worse? Is it better? What sticks out as somebody who's actually had to live through it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, one that I haven't been asked a lot. China is I think unique in that there are geographically very different parts of China. So if you were to talk to somebody who lived in Beijing and Shanghai, for example, their experience would be night and day difference from my experience because I lived in the far western region north of Tibet called Xinjiang. So I was a stone's throw away from Tajikistan and Pakistan and Kazakhstan and all those countries over there on the, kind of in the Central Asian side of things. So my experience there was very different, and even censorship changes based on where you are geographically in China. So some things are available in Beijing that aren't available to me in Xinjiang when I was there. And as an example, there were some riots that happened in 2009 in our region that I was there for. It was very tragic. But during that time, the government for that region specifically shut down the entire internet for 10 months. And it's interesting, this didn't really make the news. We had an intranet, so we were able to access news from within just our region. But we had what I called internet tourism, where people like me, and mind you, this was a huge geographic region. We would get on a train from the capital, which was called Urumqi, and we would do a 12-hour train out to the next nearest region, which was Gansu. And in order to access internet, in order for me to email my parents and let them know that we were okay. So, I mean, granted, this was back in 2009. The internet's back, up and running. But just to give you an idea of the type of controls that they have, that is like I said, it's regionally specific. And so, living through that, if you talk to the average Chinese person, they don't even really, they know that censorship exists, but they don't really care. It's maybe kind of that whole frog in a boiling pot metaphor where, if you just put the frog into boiling water, it'll jump out. That's us as expats, as people that are coming in from the outside. But if you've just grown up in that, it's not an inconvenience. You never knew what Facebook was anyway. You don't care. And they have so many great alternatives at this point that it doesn't even really matter at this point.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
But the reason I brought you here is, as much as I want to talk about that, is one of your recent videos was talking about smartphone security, and you brought up some really interesting things in that video. And while I talk about it a lot generally on the podcast, we haven't really done a real deep dive into, how do I make my smartphone more secure and private, and what are the options maybe outside of the regular ones like Apple and Google. So I want to talk about that today. And to start by saying, smartphones are today certainly are supercomputers that we always have with us. They're always connected to the internet. They are chock full of sensors, tons and tons of different sensors. And we carry them with us everywhere we go, 24/7, like to the bathroom, right? We'd never not have them. George Orwell could not possibly have imagined a better mass surveillance platform. So how should we be thinking about the dangers of these devices, that they pose for us with respect to both security and privacy?
I mean, I think you just have to, we all have to just assume that anything that we're doing on our phone is not as private as we think it is. Carrie, I did something just this morning. One of the only games that I keep on my phone right now is Spider Solitaire. My wife and I will just we'll see who can go through an entire set of Spider Solitaire faster. And I went in. Apple has what they call the app privacy report, so you can go in and kind of check. Okay, what URLs did this particular app go and check? Or same thing if you visit different websites or even podcasts and stuff like that. And so I went in, and we're talking about Spider Solitaire, right? Spider Solitaire. And I am not exaggerating when I say that there were over 100 different URLs that Spider Solitaire had accessed, most of them having to do with analytics and ads and all of that stuff. But think about that. That's 100 different URLs for something as simple as a single card game on our phone. So if you can imagine all the other apps that you use on a daily basis, like a lot of your app usage, a lot of the data that you don't think that might feel trivial to you is being sent out to a lot of different places, even though it feels like it's all just on your phone. So I like to imagine the app as like this window into my life, and I have to be careful about, how wide I open the shades to that window.
Well, and I know as a software engineer that when we're building software, it's really about a Frankenstein situation where you're piecing together software libraries and software development kits and things from all sorts of third parties. And
Yeah.
a lot of developers are like, you know what? I don't have time to redo this widget. Let me search on the web and find somebody who's already done this. Let me lump that into my app.
Yeah.
And they throw this in there whether it does 10 other things or not because I want this one thing it does. So I would venture to guess that a lot of the software developers probably don't even realize how many different ways that their own software is connecting to servers they don't even know about.
Yeah. I think, what was it? The YouTuber MKBHD was under fire for the app that he put out that he put it out and people were like, he's this tech YouTuber that likes to critique tech. And he got the tables turned on him because people downloaded the app and the first thing that came up, it says, did you know that we're going to be tracking, and then bum, 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 like 100 things. And he came back and said, I didn't even know. Like we just set this up and it was the ad company and all that stuff. And I'm sure he's right, but I think it speaks to exactly what you were saying where, we're piecing together. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so we pull together all these things and don't sometimes realize what we're doing.
So I guess the point I'm making there is you don't necessarily blame the developer, though I would argue as a software engineer, you should know what you're putting in your product.
Sure.
But this does happen. But okay. So the smartphone market today is definitely dominated, right, by two makers, Apple and Google. Certainly, at least from the operating system perspective. So at a high level, and I know this is kind of a loaded question, but how do they compare in terms of security, and then what about privacy?
Yeah. I know that, we've got a lot more that we're going to dig into here, but from a very high level, both of them are relatively, and it really depends on how we're looking at this, they're relatively secure. Privacy is kind of a different issue. Like as long as you are good, but a lot of it is really dependent upon the user. And I think this is a kind of something you're going to hear me say multiple times throughout this entire episode is that you can have an operating system or a piece of hardware that is super secure and private, but oftentimes the most vulnerable part of any of this is the user. And so we have to be very careful about being the weakest link in this entire chain. And instead of just pointing fingers at Apple and Google, even though they definitely deserve it. Now, from an overall perspective, I would say that Apple is known and respected among the privacy community as being more private than Google. And, it makes sense when you think about the fact that Google's primary business model is being an advertising company, right?
Right.
You've
Follow the money.
Yeah, exactly. We've heard about Apple being called kind of this walled garden, and if we're using that similar metaphor, I'd say that Google's more of kind of an open park that encourages innovation, but at the expense of the entry in is your privacy, your personal data. And so, Google just letting people sideload apps, that's something that Apple may be forced to do eventually, but, they've stopped for the purpose of security and privacy. Apps still get in that are malicious into these app stores, but for the most part, the checks that these apps have to go through in order to make it on the Play Store or the Apple App Store are what prevent most of these malicious apps from getting to us in the first place.
On the security part, one of the big differences, and you alluded to this, is the fact that Apple's got this walled garden thing, and it reminds me of the old Apple versus PC arguments back in the day. People who bought PCs a lot of times did it because they wanted more freedom to do whatever the heck they wanted to on their computer. And Apple was not inclined to let you do that in a lot of cases. Yeah. And that's now translated now to phones as well. But the phone ecosystem, unless you buy a Google Pixel, is also kind of fractured in the same way, where along the hardware lines for security. And that has security implications. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I assume you're talking about the fact that the Android OS can be, taken and adopted by Samsung, or it'll be adopted by these other makers that then kind of put a skin on top of it and, make their own UI, user interface, whenever you're using their phone. So it feels like a Samsung phone and not like a Google phone. But the problem is when you do that, you are also introducing a lot of different security risks. Like, let me say it this way. I think the better way to talk about it is maybe to compare it with the way that Apple does it, or with, like the Google Pixel. When you're able to integrate everything vertically, and so what that means is you've got the hardware that talks to the software, even down further, upstream when you're talking about chipsets, right? With Apple and the way that they design their chipsets, they are able to see that entire vertical stream of things and be able to design it in a way that makes sure that, okay, whenever you are, putting your biometrics in, your fingerprint or your Face ID, that is stored on a separate part of the chip that isn't accessible by the applications themselves. So for Apple, that's what they call the secure enclave on their chips. And so it keeps that entirely separate. And it's those type of things that we may not realize as users, but by being vertically integrated, it allows them to put in those kind of security features. Yeah, I'm sure you've got something in your mind as you're even talking about this. Like what were you thinking of?
Yeah, so one of the slides I put in, I've got a class I teach on this, and when we talk about smartphones, one of the slides I found this really cool table, and it's a little dated now, but I think it's probably still generally true, is it breaks down how long it takes for like a security vulnerability fix, a patch, to go through the system on Apple versus Google Pixel versus a Samsung phone. And because not only are there the hardware manufacturers, but then there's the carriers on the Android side, where every one of them is like a different cook in the kitchen, and they've all got to go through their vetting processes. So the time it takes from the time a vulnerability was found and fixed to actually get on your phone was much longer for Android phones, unless you have a Pixel, which makes it more like the Apple case.
Correct. Yeah, no, that's a great point, I think. And even the way you said that with like different cooks in the kitchen, you're right. The more people you add in the middle between the device and then the eventual operating system, the harder it's going to be to make sure that you can get those updates and that you can secure the entire chain.
There's two different sides of when you talk about cybersecurity. It's usually whether you have physical possession of something or not. So let's talk about the remote case first. How hard is it to attack? Because this is the most common case for people on cell phones, and the one we worry about the most because it opens up attacks to anybody on the planet because we're on the internet all the time. So how hard is it actually to attack our smartphones remotely? And what are some of the techniques? And while we're at it, is there any way to defend against those?
Sure. Well, we're again looking at this from a couple different angles. Like if we're talking about somebody actually getting access to your device, and I get emails from people all the time who are like, I think somebody has, access into my device and they're watching every single thing that I do. That type of access is extremely difficult to get. More often than not, I don't always say this when I email back to people, but more often than not, it's in your head. Like there isn't somebody that has actually somehow gained access to your device because
you're probably not that important.
Exactly. That is so true. You're not as important as you think you are to warrant that, because that's something that like state governments might have the ability to do. But even then, it's at high expense, right? Very, very high expense. More often than not, what we have to be worried about is somebody gaining access to our accounts on these devices. So your email accounts, your social media accounts, that is much more likely than somebody actually gaining access to the device itself and being able to turn on a camera, turn on the microphone and listen into everything that you're doing. That would usually require somebody having physical access to the device in order to do that. But remotely, more often than not, you're going to be getting people that are trying to use phishing scams or social engineering to get you to somehow give up or type in, your password, to give over 2FA, to steal that 2FA token. Those are the type of things that are more likely. And so I've had friends that are in the business world and YouTube that have had their YouTube accounts taken over, and then they'll replace everything on their account with these scam cryptocurrency videos, right? And it eventually comes down, but it's really, really stressful for them at that time, right? Yeah. Or somebody who's had their email account hacked and suddenly they're sending emails to friends asking for money because they need help and like they're having to recover from all this stuff. Those are the things that we need to be a lot more worried about than necessarily somebody getting into our device. And so that's where, stronger passwords, 2FA, setting up some of these advanced protections for our accounts, and then educating ourselves on how these type of attacks happen, that's where those things become really important.
Right. Okay. So as you said, physical access is a whole different ball of wax. And, security people often say that, all bets are off if someone gains physical access to your device.
Yeah.
If they could walk away behind go in the back room and then come back and bring your phone to you, you don't know what the heck is happening to that, right? Physical possession makes it very different.
Yeah.
And yet this, you might think, okay, when's that going to happen? But this is actually could be a real threat. I mean, you could lose your device and then who knows what someone's done to it, or it could be stolen, or, maybe you're crossing the border and you're going into a country and part of their process is, can you hand me your cell phone? Can you unlock your cell phone for me? I've heard some of them ask for your social media accounts and things when you cross certain borders. And anyway, if I'm handing my device over to someone and they actually have physical access to it, what can I do in that case? What might I do to prepare for that so I could try to prevent them from using Celebrite or one of these tools to image my phone or do something nasty with my phone? Anything I could do in that case?
Well, I love that you talked about prepare, because if you're just handing your phone over for the first time and you haven't thought about this, then it's kind of like, all right, well, good luck.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things I'd say. First of all, you'd mentioned cross-border stuff. And this is one of those things where I was telling you about my time in China. One of those things that happened was I remember often they had these checkpoints throughout the city. This was throughout the whole region. And it was mainly for the locals. There were two ethnic groups that were kind of at odds with each other. But we as foreigners got caught in the middle of all that. And so I would get off of the bus and there would be police sitting there with a table, and then you would have to plug in your phone. And they said they were searching for specific videos or images or something like that were anti-government is what they said they were searching for. But the fact is they plug in. And of course, your phone, let's say it's an Apple phone or even a Google phone, will ask you to type in your passcode. And there's police there. And they say, well, type in your code. You have you can't just say, oh, I don't know my passcode. Like, they will force you to put that in, right? It's kind of that idea of, okay, if at gunpoint, what are you going to do? You have to do it. And so you put that in. I remember after that happened the first time, I emailed Apple and I was like, what can they access if they're plugged in and I put in my passcode? And the answer, and granted, this was 10 years back, so maybe things have changed, but I don't think they have. The answer was pretty much anything, right? Like, if it's plugged into the device and you have input your passcode, they are assuming that you have given permission for whatever device that is plugged in to have access to the files on that phone. So with that in mind, I always say that if you're crossing borders, I would be very careful about a number of things. Either you can just bring a secondary phone. If you're a business person, this is usually done with corporate travelers where they'll be handed a secondary phone and a secondary laptop if they're going into certain countries. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. It feels weird as us just common people that, oh, well, is there anything really that big a deal? For those of us that maybe using a secondary phone is either out of our budget or it just seems like too much, then I would just think about what is on my phone that if somebody had access, like just open access to my phone, what would they have access to? And you'd be surprised at the really sensitive things that we keep on our phone.
Yeah.
Or
that can be accessed from your phone. Yeah.
Exactly. Or that we stay constantly logged into from our phone. And so those are the type of things that I would just consider, is that absolutely necessary for me to keep on my phone at all times, right? I've known some people that keep a note, just a note on their phone that has all of their social security numbers of their family members, because they might need to go and access that. There are ways that you can put data on a device that is still encrypted behind a password or biometrics. And if you absolutely must have access to that kind of data on the go, then at least put it behind an additional layer of security. But really going through and looking at your phone from more of a critical eye and saying, what is the data that is accessible from this device if somebody were to unlock it or just copy all of the files? Because I don't want to keep a lot of those files on my phone.
Well, I think I've heard some people say that what they will do if they have to use their own phone, it's kind of unique with phones, and a lot of the data that is quote unquote on your phone is usually cloud backed up. So in a lot of cases, you can actually just outright delete the data and apps off your phone that you're worried about. And then when you get back home, just reinstall them and the data will come back.
Exactly. No, that's a great point, especially if you've got it backed up that you can you can delete and restore. I would say the same thing about password managers. You know, I know 1Password has a travel mode where you can, tell it I'm traveling now, and it will remove certain vaults that you've just, that you've told it are ones that you don't want available if you're traveling. And again, you can go online and on your computer and find those if you absolutely need those passwords. But removing it from your mobile device is what's going to be most important.
Over the years, Apple and Google both have added some really powerful security features to the mobile devices. And this actually kind of leads a little bit from the last one. For example, Apple's lockdown mode I thought was fantastic.
Sure.
I'm less of an Android user, so there may be equivalent things on the Android side that I'm not familiar with. But can you maybe talk to us about some of these most recent features that have been added that are more promising from a security and privacy perspective? And are there any important features that are still missing that you wish that the phones could have?
Yeah, well, tying back to our previous question we were talking about, both Apple and Google offer some kind of stolen device protection. So Apple calls it stolen device protection. Google calls it theft detection lock, where it uses motion detection, AI, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth to determine if what they think the motion of that phone has been, pulled away and run away from its normal location. And when you turn that on, it makes changing any security settings. It requires a delay before you can do any of that stuff. So that's one of those things that it's an easy, I would tell my mom and my dad, hey, go ahead and turn that on. It's not going to affect your daily usage, and it might prove useful if somebody were to actually steal your device. Because I spend a lot of time just in that last question talking about cross-border. And maybe that's not something that people are worried about, but they're worried about a stolen device. Yeah. And that is one of those things that I would put in there is one, make sure that you've got a strong passcode to get in. So something that's more than 4 digits, at least 6, if not more digits long. And then adding that stolen device protection or that theft detection lock. You talked about lockdown mode. A lot of people don't even know what that is. Like lockdown mode was an interesting new feature. I think it was like iOS 15 or 16 when that got added.
Yeah, it wasn't too long ago. Yep.
Yeah, and it did some interesting things. Like it would block the ability for a random number to FaceTime you, right? Yes. Or it would block the ability for certain message attachments through iMessage. Definitely for certain the previews, I think it would stop all the previews. It would block certain web browsing tech. So certain websites I go on to and it's a broken website. It doesn't work as well. And then it would automatically, anytime that you share photos, it would strip a lot of the GPS EXIF data, so that there wouldn't be any tracking on the photos. So it was just little things like that. And I remember I still have it on now. And it doesn't really affect my day-to-day usage. You might find for some people that, going on to certain websites, it might break those websites. But for the most part, Apple promotes it as only for journalists or sensitive, highly targeted people. But I just don't understand why. I think it's more of that whole convenience and usability versus privacy and security balance that we all have to find. But that lockdown mode's a pretty easy one. The other one that I suggest, and this is on the Apple side, is something called advanced data protection. And this has been in the news a little bit recently because of the stuff in the UK. But advanced data protection did a couple things that I thought was interesting. One, it revealed to the public how much of our data is actually accessible to Apple. Because Apple had to basically say, hey, if you want to really own the keys to your data, then you're going to have to turn on this extra setting. And it's like, oh, like what kind of data? And I pulled it up just so that I could have it. But it's like your notes, your photos, anything in your iCloud drive, your voice memos, wallet passes, like all of this stuff had always been accessible and viewed by Apple. Like if you're thinking about a door that has been locked, right? Imagine that it's you've got a key, but you also give Apple a key to like they have a copy of that same key, so that it's locked from most anybody else, but Apple has a key to that. So now what they're saying is, all right, we've got a key to this door, but when you go in, we're going to have another like closet that only you have the key to. But we warn you, if you lock yourself out of this closet, we cannot help you. Anything that you have in the closet, we're not going to be able to give you access to. So what they do is they force you to set up a lot of these security features as backups. Like, do you have a trusted backup? Can we give a key to your mom and dad? Can we give a key? We won't hold the key, but we want to make sure that you don't come to us crying whenever you lose your key. And so if you ever turn on advanced data protection, it's almost silly how many times Apple just reminds you, just so you know, we won't be able to help you. There is no forgot password.
Right.
And that's true. I think as we move into a more end-to-end encrypted world, it's good for us who grew up with this whole forgot password link to remember that in order for us to own our privacy and to own our data, we have to be responsible for it. Yeah. And being responsible means, owning your own keys. And I love it. Like, I've got these 2FA keys, my favorites from YubiKey, right? From Yubico. And my favorite question that people ask me is like, well, what if I lose my key? Well, I mean, hopefully, as I've walked you through this, we've set up a backup, you've, downloaded some backup codes. But honestly, what do you do if you lose a key to your car? Like, how often has that happened? Like, you hold on to the things that are valuable, that are important. And so it's about prioritizing that privacy and security. So that's advanced data protection. It creates end-to-end encryption for things like your iCloud backup, photos, notes, a lot of that stuff. And that is, if you've been watching the news, what the UK government has asked Apple to turn off. And Apple has reluctantly agreed. So essentially what Apple's saying is, hey, we're not going to create a backdoor. We don't want to create a backdoor to our data, but the UK government has told us that we can't encrypt this data, and so they can ask for it. So just know that they can ask for this data. And the fact that a government wants something like advanced data protection to not be available should be enough of a clue to all of us regular people that, that's something we should probably turn on.
Right.
And it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to do. So that's something I would recommend for somebody that's on an Apple device. For Google, they have something called Advanced Protection Program. And this is this affects your Android usage. It affects YouTube. It affects everything that you do using your Google account. At its core, really, like I don't love the Advanced Data Protection Program, or the Advanced Protection Program, but it really just forces people to use a 2FA key is the biggest thing. And for some people, that's a big step, right?
Like a physical key, right?
A physical 2FA key. Yeah, you have to have a physical 2FA key. So you can't use SMS text, those 6-digit numbers that they text to you. You can't use an authenticator app. You have to use a 2FA key for Advanced Protection Program. And then it stops you from sideloading apps, right? There's certain settings within an Android that it would stop you from being able to do. So those are the type of things that are available. And I'm pretty sure there is a similar lockdown mode that is in beta for Android 16. I think it is a lockdown mode that's in beta. So that's coming up for Android, but I don't think it's out yet, and it should be later this year.
So do you have any dream things you'd like to, I'll give you an example. So, and I learned about this, I think from the Anam phone when I interviewed Joseph Cox, and this was actually something I think Veracrypt or one of the other hard drive encryption apps had at some point, and that is you could have 2 different keys to unlock it. And there was one key that if you put in, it like gave a little bit of data, where you could kind of pretend that this was fine, let me enter my passcode, fine, you could see my data. And it was all kind of just dummy data. Yeah. I think it'd be kind of cool, at least for people who need it, if you could enter 2 different passcodes, and if you enter one passcode, it shows a little bit of stuff, and then I don't know, that's something that I think would be kind of cool. Maybe it's most
Yeah.
people don't need that.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. What I was going to say, I think it's basically very similar to what you're talking about is essentially profiles. I wish, at least for my Apple iPhone, that I could have a different profile.
I
So
agree.
one that is for travel or one that is for home. And I know that there's there's the open source operating systems. I think Graphene OS allows for that. And so, yeah, something like that. One of the things that I had wanted for a while and finally came for Apple, I don't know if it's available for Google, is I always didn't like the idea that, let's say somebody did steal my phone and they had looked over my shoulder and they had found my passcode. Yeah. Right. It's like, oh, that sucks. But don't worry. Some of my important apps are backed up by Face ID. So that's fine. Right. Yeah. Except you do Face ID a couple times and it says, oh, are you having problems? Here, just use your passcode to get into it. And it's like, well, oh my gosh, you just totally negated all the security there. Now, if you long press an app, you can say require Face ID. So in other words, it won't allow for a backup with your passcode. So you can choose which apps you want that. And that's something that came out, I think, with the most recent iOS update that, I turn on for, my password app or, my banking app or something like that, just to make sure if somebody gets access to my phone and they somehow saw me type in my passcode, I don't want that passcode to give them access to everything.
Right. You know what? Actually, and you saying that reminds me, another feature that came out with which I have not even tried to play with, and I can't believe I haven't tried this yet. You can hide apps. Yeah. On iOS now, which is actually kind of what I was looking for before. But you got to do app by app. You've got to create these sets of hidden apps. But yeah, I forgot about that. They're adding a lot of really cool stuff, and unfortunately, there are scenarios where people's lives might depend on some of those things.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So we talked a little bit about what's going on in the UK, and I've certainly covered that in the podcast. And there has been. There's been a lot of pressure. We had the crypto wars starting back in the 90s. When the government was resisting regular people getting access to serious encryption. And so, a lot of governments have been pressuring both Apple and Google we got to catch the bad guys. And to catch the bad guys, we need privileged access somehow. Call it a backdoor. That's kind of a really bad name for some of what they're asking for. And in a lot of cases, they're asking for something so generically, like, I don't care how it's done. I just need access. You figure it out. You're the guys, the tech guys. You figure it out. But I need access. And so we're going to require that. And it's all this, this is all state sanctioned stuff. Sometimes the CSAM scanning, that was something else that keeps coming around. We want you to put something on your phone that will scan your devices, initially for child sexual abuse material, which we all agree is horrific stuff. Correct. But it's a slippery slope, right? You take that to, let's say, China, and they might want to use it. Okay, since you're doing that anyway, why don't you scan for, anti-government stuff while you're at it, and we will require you to do that because that's now the law here. Yeah. So the way it went down in the UK actually was really weird because we had this in the US too with national security letters. If the government, the intelligence agency come at you and ask you to do these things, in a lot of cases, you're not legally allowed to say that they've approached you. And if somebody had not leaked to the Washington Post that the UK had asked Apple to do this, they weren't supposed to tell anybody. They were just supposed to do it. Mm-hmm. So that got caught. But how do we know, given that is possible, how can we trust anything anymore? Yeah. And I think the sad answer is we kind of can't. But there's still things we can do, right? I kind of assume that if I'm using iCloud and putting my data into iCloud, even if I'm using advanced data protection, I still want to be very careful about what I'm putting into that iCloud account. So instead, what I want to do is I want to choose the companies that I feel like I would trust more. And I think we might even, I can start now just talking about some different alternatives, but it's like, okay, iMessage is great, or using just WhatsApp and WhatsApp is supposedly encrypted to, between users. But to use an alternative, something like Signal or Threema, or there's others that are out there that give me more confidence, partially because of their business model, partially because of maybe being open source, like a lot of these things that Apple and Google can't necessarily share or guarantee. Right. And these companies are not, don't have the incentive. Maybe they don't have the pressure from governments to capitulate to a lot of these requests that they might have, or probably don't even get these requests as much as an Apple or a Google do. So taking and deciding, okay, where do I want to put my data?
You don't have to use iCloud.
Right.
You don't have to use a lot of these services that are taking your data, even if they are encrypted. Like there are alternatives that can, at least for me, give me more confidence of where I'm putting my data.
Yeah, and it's a layered approach. It could be, you could call it defense in depth. For example, even if you're using iCloud Drive for your storage, you could layer on top of that something like Cryptomator.
Correct.
You could set up a Cryptomator vault within your iCloud Drive where it's kind of double wrapped. It's double encrypted.
Yeah.
And in one of them, you're pretty sure that you're the only one that has the key to that. And the other thing I think it brings to light is the fact, and this is something I brought up when I talked about the whole UK thing, is that if you try to outlaw this stuff, if you go to the big companies and say, you've got to give us access, then the people that know what they're doing, and the criminals generally are pretty good at figuring this stuff out, they're gonna find ways to protect their stuff. It just means all the rest of us schmoes can't have it.
Exactly. Yeah, I do think that's the unfortunate part of all this is they're basically making the lowest hanging fruit, not the people that they really want to get, but just the average person who's now left out to dry.
What about the various applications? And I think one of the things about security and privacy, I think that the differences are is that in most cases, we're on the same side for security. Google wants you to be secure. I want to be secure. We're on the same side. We have the same goals, same incentives.
Great
privacy
point.
is different,
Yeah.
right? I mean, usually it's totally private from everybody but us. But you could trust us.
Yeah.
You know, we have access to it, but that's cool, right? So when it comes to privacy and some of the Google and Apple offer all sorts of productivity apps and cloud storage and other things, do you have a feel for whether or not you generally trust them with privacy, and if not, why not?
Yeah, well, the one thing that these the Apple and Google have going for them with their apps is that they're so well integrated into the system that it just makes it so easy to use, right?
Yes.
And that's why it's hard for people like my mom and dad or a lot of the people that I talk to from my All Things Secured channel. It's like moving away from this is giving up a lot of convenience and a lot of just really easy, fun to use features and apps. And that's why, one of the things that I encourage people to do, even as we're talking about this, is you don't have to think about this in binary terms. It's either I use Apple and Google apps, or I completely transform my life and I go cold turkey. Like there are ways, like I have, and this just being an example, I've got two phones, right? I've got one that's my Apple phone, and then I've got one that is an open source Graphene OS. So that's basically a Pixel that has been removed, like has had all of the Google services removed from it, and now it's just running Graphene OS on it. And I'm still in the process, to be true, to be honest with you, but slowly kind of separating my digital life between those two devices and trying to make sure, okay, do I still use the Apple Notes app? Yeah. Like I'll put in my grocery list for the Apple Notes app, or if I'm, making a note verbally to Siri, she'll put it in there. But if I'm making a note about, let's say again, just using the example of my kids' passport numbers and all the information that goes in there, because I live overseas and I'm constantly being asked for those type of numbers. I need to have access to it, but I don't want that to be in my Apple Notes app, right? So that would go into Proton Pass, for me, with 1Password, one of these other apps that I know is encrypted, and it's double encrypted, even beyond just my Proton password, right? There's the Proton password, and then there's the Proton Pass password, which is the password manager within the suite of secure, privacy apps that Proton makes. So, just slowly trying to divide out and I just closed my Evernote subscription because I'd had that for the longest time, and I finally moved everything out of it. It took me years. Yeah. Not because it was that much data, but just because I was that lazy about it. But moving that stuff out and finding a better place for it. So just to reiterate, it's not about taking and deleting every single app that you used to use and replacing it with something that's open source. It's finding the things that are most important to you. Do you not want Google and Apple to have your GPS, tracking data? Well, then instead of using Apple Maps or Google Maps, there are alternatives like OSM that can even do offline maps if you download it, right? And there's a lot of these other ones. but maybe somebody else doesn't care that much about it, but they care a lot more, about the video calls that they do. So instead of FaceTime, or Google Meet, they use Jitsi, right? JITSI. Like, it's just these individual choices for individual apps, and it doesn't have to be all at once. It can just be little things here and there as you learn how to separate out your life between, what is convenient and what you like doing, and then the things that you really want to keep private.
I'm so glad you said that. And I'm so glad that somebody else said that, because I tend to say the same kind of thing, but it's good to hear it from other people too, because there are definitely a lot of purists out there and you kind of alluded to this earlier, where it's like, look, if you're not going full tilt on this stuff, don't even talk to me. Like, you're not real. That, you're a poser. And it's like, no, that can't be the answer. It's just like going off the grid is not an answer, because you've got to live life. I mean, modern life, if you're going to enjoy it and have a quality of life, you've got to, that's all about trade-offs, and it's all about your personal threat model. And part of the threat model isn't like attackers necessarily. It's also, what are you comfortable doing? What are you actually going to do? Because all these things in theory sound great, but if you're not going to do them, then they don't work. Right? I mean, so yes, there's so much nuance to this. There's lots of angles to this, and I'm glad to hear someone else say that you don't have to be 100%.
Yeah. I like to call it practical privacy.
Yeah.
Because it may not be a total privacy, but I think that's kind of a misnomer anyway. I don't think that we can have total privacy, but I don't mean that in like a really negative, depressing way. It's just, no, we just live in a world where that's kind of a pipe dream. So what are practical ways that we can build privacy? And like you said, I love that you're actually going to do, because that's a key part of it.
Okay, so one thing I can't go without talking about this one, because it's all over the place, and we're all getting sick of this. But AI, and AI even is a poor term, but mostly we're talking probably about large language models and chatbots. Those are the things that are kind of hot today. But everybody and their brother is scrambling to add AI to all their marketing, certainly, and then somewhere in their products, there's got to be AI going on, right?
Yeah,
and including Apple and Google, right? And Apple's been a little late to the game, and they're certainly struggling, I think.
Okay.
And Google Gemini has got issues as well, but in many cases, these AI features are enabled by default, which really sucks. I'm really pissed off that Apple has done that in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And sometimes they just come via a regular software update, because they're adding it to apps you already have, or and on the phone you already have. They're just like, this is a new feature that came with a software update, and oh, by the way, it's on by default. And many of these AI services send data to the cloud under the covers for processing. Now, Apple, I think to their credit, has tried to keep everything local where they can. And they've actually got this private compute thing that's pretty cool. Sounds good. But nevertheless, AI adds a whole new dimension to privacy problems and even security problems. So give me your take on that. What do you think are the dangers of AI, and what can we do about those dangers?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree that Apple has been terrible at this. I don't know if you've seen like their summaries of text messages. It's just terrible.
Horrible.
It's like, was useless. And yes, they do. Let's say that I believe what they're saying, and everything that happens for Apple Intelligence stays on the device and is done on the device, which is great. But half the time that I ask Siri something, it's like, would you like me to go to ChatGPT to answer this? Well, I promise you that isn't done on device. And so any of that data is being uploaded to ChatGPT. And, they say that there's privacy involved in that too. Take that with a grain of salt. The way that these LLMs, these large language models, work is just by continually ingesting this information and using it to improve the model, right? That's part of what makes it so powerful. And so they are only as powerful as the data we give them. And the problem is, I think we're moving into a world where the more information they know about us, the better the responses and answers and help that they will be. And I think that that's something that hopefully will be worked through over time. I think that NVIDIA even introduced, a new thing recently where, hey, you can have your own LLM on a device that doesn't even have to be connected to the internet. It'll do everything on this, small device. And I think that's eventually where we're moving, where it might be light LLMs that, you can't ask it everything, but it's, it becomes an expert in this one thing. In the meantime, we're faced with an interesting dilemma where we have to decide how we want to use these these tools that are at our disposal. And I think of it in a way almost like early Facebook or early, what was that other social media site that went down? MySpace, where people just didn't realize that the internet was a permanent thing at the time.
Yeah, right.
And just put everything out there and then kind of had to claw back once we all realized, whoa, this is dangerous. And I think we kind of have to treat AI in the same way where, yes, use it. I think that we all need to become like, there's no turning back. Like, we're going to have to learn how to use AI. So don't stick your head under a rock, but just be very, very careful about how you handle, what kind of data you feed into any type of LLM that you're using. And then I will mention this, Carrie, I don't know how familiar you are, but there are some options to use these that disconnects it from your identity. So the one that I'm testing right now, and I'm not like, this is just one example, I'm not affiliated with them at all, but hoodie.ai or hoodie.com/AI, I think is one of them. Essentially what it does is you can do it and you can use all of the different LLMs anonymously, and it doesn't connect to your personal information. It's not connected to your name. And after every usage, it kind of resets and pretends like you're a new user. And of course, there's trade-offs there. You can't continually go back to some of the old things that you did. You can't have it all your information in memory, which is kind of what happens is, let's say if you have a Chat GPT subscription where it'll just keep in memory all those different things. So there are ways to use AI somewhat anonymously, but I think the main takeaway for me is I just want to be really careful about what kind of data and the things that I'm asking it to do.
Well, yes, absolutely. I agree. And it doesn't surprise me at all that there's new front ends for some of these things, like we've done with search engines, for example. There's search engines where you could search Google without being directly on Google for the exact same reasons. But some of the things that really worry me are like Microsoft Copilot and Apple Intelligence probably doing this too, and Google maybe as well, where I'm a Microsoft 365 user, and because I grew up on Word and Excel, and it's what I know. I mean, I've got pages, I've got numbers, which I'm sure are just fine that come with Apple, but I'm used to Microsoft Office, so I still use those, and I wish I could get it myself off, but I can't. So anyway, but they're adding Copilot now to all these things magically, automatically. The next update now there's a little Copilot symbol, which to me means that my documents, as soon as I load them, maybe before, are getting sent to the cloud to get analyzed, to have these nice, it's like Clippy on steroids. Remember Clippy, right?
Yep.
Coming back and suggesting, it looks like you're writing a suicide note. Would you like help? That's the classic joke, right? but so it's not even, the interaction could be, you might not see it. You might not be something you're directly doing. It could be passive, because I think we're adding it to everything now. And that is I think people are really going to get burned.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. I think that, like you said, in the race for all companies to add something in AI in order to stay up with the times, a lot of times we either don't know that it's being added or we don't even get the choice. And I think I don't even know if I've got an answer to that. I don't know if you've got an answer to that. I think a lot of times there is power in sending a note to a company and saying, can you at least just give me the option to turn this off, right? If they get enough of those type of messages, like, they will at least consider it. I don't know if they would turn it off or not, but you make enough noise and sometimes things can change.
I agree 100%. And that is something that I wish more people would do. We're not powerless in this. We have a voice. And you're right. If enough of us say it, and coupled with that, I always tell people that you need to vote both at the ballot box and at the checkout lane. With your wallet and with your and with a ballot, because those things do matter. And if enough of us do it, that will make a difference. Support and send money to the companies that are doing the right things. So make sure that they're rewarded for doing the right things, and then make sure everybody else realizes, there's a market for privacy. Maybe I should be doing those things too.
Yeah.
Okay, so you already mentioned graphene. I don't know if any of my audience, I know some of my audience knows what that is.
Sure.
But tell me a little bit about, if we're going to go outside Apple and outside Google for smartphone stuff, what are those options? What do they look like? How hard is it to set those up?
They're not as hard as I thought they would be, honestly. So I bought a Google Pixel, and, downloading Graphene OS is free, right? It's an open source project. So setting it up on the Pixel phone was, I mean, it took about an hour, 2 hours, and most of that was just sitting there waiting for everything to finish on the upload. And the instructions were fairly easy to follow for me. Like there wasn't anything particularly difficult about it all. I think the hardest part was now I had this open source phone and it has no apps on it really. So I've got to figure out everything on my own. You know, there are a lot of different additional app stores. There's one called F-Droid. There's others out there where you can even on a phone that has Graphene OS, you can still download Instagram. You could still download Facebook. Like you can still download all of your favorite apps if you wanted to and use those and log in. And so like they'll be able to track what you're doing because you'll have to be logged into that account, but it's not necessarily connected then through your Apple account and everything else that you're doing on your phone. So there are advantages to doing something like that. Like again, for me, I told you I'm still in process of understanding how I'm best going to use an open source phone because I've only been using one for about 4 months now. And one of the things that I like is not even having a SIM card in it, right? Like just using the Wi-Fi capabilities for the phone and just saying, okay, this is only going to be used when I'm when I'm at my office or I'm at my house and I've got trusted Wi-Fi networks that I'm using. So really trying to control that environment. So, I mean, it gives me hope to kind of see that and go, this isn't like, I remember back in the days, like, gosh, it was probably 15, 20 years ago when you would try to do something outside of the system and it was just like you had to have a PhD in, Linux and all this stuff to try to get it all figured out. Nowadays, it doesn't feel that much different than a regular Android phone. It's just open source. And now you're using things just slightly differently.
That's so funny because I've done almost the exact same thing. I went and got myself, it was a Pixel 6a or 7a. It was on sale for $250. Mm-hmm. And I put graphene on it. It had a web installer, which was pretty cool, which went pretty well. I had trouble actually getting the connection cable to work. Once I actually had a decent cable, I was able to upload that without much trouble. You got F-Droid, you got Aurora, I think it was the other one. Yep. And same thing, no SIM card. So I've got no cell phone account associated with it. And I even figured, worst case, I could hotspot to my iPhone.
Exactly.
If I wanted to get, something, get internet access where I don't have Wi-Fi. So yeah, that's funny. You and I are on the same path there. And again, probably like you I've only played with it. It's certainly not my daily driver, but I wanted to try it, see what it was like. And so, absolutely. All right. So a couple of things before we go. All right. So at the end of the day, deep question for you. What worries you the most about our current state of affairs? If you had to name just a couple of things, and then what gives you hope? I mean, do you think things going to get better, things going to get worse?
Yeah, I think that what worries me most is that our governments and everything, they're not incentivized. Like there is no incentive to give us more privacy. So this is always going to be an uphill battle for people. And I think that it's one that everybody has to choose how high they're going to roll the boulder up that hill and how much effort they're going to put into it. But it isn't one of those things where I see into the future and think, oh, this is important enough that it's going to get easier, right? Mm-hmm. There's this idea that privacy just isn't on by default. And I just don't think that's going to change. And so anybody who is concerned about privacy is going to have to take those matters into their own hands and really decide for themselves how they want to implement privacy. As far as hope goes, I am very optimistic and about all the different tools and companies that are popping up that make that a little easier and more fun to introduce privacy into our lives. It's like you were saying, I think that over the past decade, we've seen people that are more willing to give to open source projects or to move their dollars into these software companies and hardware companies that are building things that are more privacy focused. And because of that, like we're just seeing some really cool tech that's out that I think does allow us to be more private and to do so without again, like I said, having to have this PhD, having to like really have a deep knowledge of technology. Like it can be something that the average person can do, and it's just deciding am I going to pay for this or am I going to pay for that?
And the technology is out there. It's rock solid. It's understood by people who are really, really smart.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. The challenge now is making it accessible. It's making it usable and easy for everybody to do. That's the real challenge. And that is not easy. And that's not the same kind of a technical challenge at all.
Yeah.
As inventing the next great crypto that's quantum safe or something, right? I mean, that's a whole different ball of wax, and we need people on that.
Yeah.
Okay. So last question. You have a lot of great material on your site. So how can we learn more from you?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can always go to the YouTube channel, which is where I upload videos usually on about a weekly basis, and that's youtube.com/@allthingssecured. I also have the website, allthingssecured.com. But for, a lot of people, just getting something, I've got a newsletter that I put out that you can go to with allthingssecured.com/newsletter, where I send out weekly, just kind of bullet points of what are the things that have happened in privacy and security this week that might be valuable for the average person to know, right? Like this UK thing that happened and what that means and what exactly is advanced data protection, like those type of things. That's something that I send out on a weekly basis. So, people that want to know more about that's where they can find that out.
Well, fantastic. You're doing great work. Please keep doing what you're doing because we need more of that stuff. So thanks. And thanks for coming on the show. I had a lot of fun. Thanks.
Hey, Gary, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Big thanks to Josh for coming on the show. I'm so glad I finally had a chance to interview him. He's a really nice guy. And again, great content. Check out his site, All Things Secured. We talked about a lot of different products today and services. I tried to put links to all of that in today's show notes. So if you heard something today that interests you, look in the show notes for a link. He talked a little about Hoodie AI, which I had not heard of. But just FYI, check that one out. But there's also another one from DuckDuckGo now, too. Basically, it's a privacy proxy for these AI tools. So if you just want to dip in real quick and ask a few questions and not worry about it saving that information and associating that query with you, check out one of those two sites, bookmark those, keep those handy. And the nice thing about those is they actually let you access multiple different tools. You can try other tools and see which one gives you the best answer. So we've got the bonus Q&A on Thursday, as usual. Some extra questions with Josh for the patrons. Josh tells a crazy story about an ordeal that he and his wife went through when they left China, and when he found out just how much he had been monitored while he was there, and why he's no longer allowed to go back to China. I asked him how hard it is to get to the internet when you're in China. In other words, get past the quote-unquote Great Firewall of China. And of course, there are other countries that do this too. So we'll talk about the kind of tech that you need in a repressive regime when you want to get past state-level internet censorship. And then we just kind of have some discussions about, both kind of being in the same space, how we try to convince people what are some of the more effective arguments for getting people to care about security and privacy. Maybe not just for themselves, but for their loved ones. So, as usual, all that bonus content will come out Thursday for the patrons. Now, I have a couple guest appearances myself coming up. I was the guest on someone else's podcast, two in particular. I was a guest on the Data Diva podcast with Debbie Reynolds. That will be coming out March 18th. And then I will actually be interviewing her for this podcast coming up soon. It won't air for a little bit, but we will be recording that interview shortly. And then I was also interviewed again by David Reese from Malwarebytes on their Lock and Code podcast. Dave and I have known each other for many years. He's been on this show. I've been on his show. And we do need to get him back on this show. But that interview where we talk about Google's Chrome browser and the privacy considerations around that particular browser, that will be coming out, I believe, on Sunday, March 23rd. Anyway, once those are both out, I will mention them again and put links in the show notes, probably for next week's podcast. And then finally, just some, next week we have a new show as usual. We've got lots of really interesting stories actually for next week's show. Some interesting articles have come out and raised some interesting questions. Of course, I'll be talking about Amazon's decision to enable its voice recording, its audio recording on its Alexa smart speakers 100% of the time for everybody, unless you've explicitly told it not to. And then we'll also talk about, you may have seen articles about a Bluetooth backdoor that was setting everybody's hair on fire, myself included. The first article I read about that sounded pretty concerning. But as other people took a look at this, turns out it wasn't really a backdoor. So that and many more very interesting stories will be in next week's news show. I've got some interviews ready to go from Lisa Lavasser from Internet Safety Labs. Also with Oz Jones, we'll be talking about some blue teaming. That is how businesses protect themselves from hacker attacks. And Zach Edwards will be talking about Gravy Analytics and just the amazing amounts of information that are being collected about us, in particular location information. I have many other ones in the works, including one with Cory Doctorow. That'll be a few months out probably at this point, but always fun to talk to Cory. He'll be coming back on the show soon. And by the way, I'll just throw this out there. If anybody has some ideas or some requests for people they would like me to talk to, shoot me an email. You can always send me ideas at feedback@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. All right, that'll do it this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.